Probably the most frustrating thing that can happen to you when you start programming Lego robots is for you to write a program, download it to your NXT, and find that when you run it on your NXT, the robot doesn't do what you expected it to do. In the next 2 lessons, I'm going to walk you through the 2 most common ways that this happens to my students at this point in an Intro to Programming Robots class. By the end of these lessons, you'll understand what's going on, and you'll know what to do in the future if you do happen to bump into them again on your own. Yet again, I want to make sure that you're doing exactly the same thing as I am, and that you don't encounter these problems until I explain how to deal with them. So please quit from the NXT software on your computer and turn off your NXT before you continue. This is the last time I'm going to ask you to do this. After this lesson, if you do encounter the problem I'm concerned about, you'll know how to deal with it. Okay, so start up your software. And open up your Sleepy Goodnight program. I'm going to do that with File, Open. And there's Sleepy Goodnight. And there it is. So the first thing I want you to do is just turn on your NXT. And let's download and run this program to the NXT. So I'll download it. There we go. And now let's just run it. So orange button for My Files, orange button for Software Files, orange button for Sleepy Goodnight. And then I'm going to push the Run button. And it worked great. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to make a new program that does the same thing, but I want to change the picture in between the words good and night. And I could start from scratch, but I'm just going to do a Save As. So I'm going to do File menu, and I'm going to say Save As. And instead of Sleepy Goodnight, I'm going to call this Sleepy Crazy. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is, let's just look at the program for a minute. We've got our sleepy eyes, and then it says Good Night. And I want to put the some crazy eyes just in between these 2 blocks. So I'm going to grab another display block, and if you can see this little white bar here, it kind of shows you where the block's going to go, and the blocks will move aside for you to make some space. So I'll drop that in there, and I don't want the smiley face. I actually want something called Crazy01. So let's go up and find Crazy01. There we go, some crazy eyes. Okay, and I'm going to save this. Always good to save your programs. And now I'm going to download this to my NXT. Cool. All right. So now let's take a look at the robot and see what happens. When I hit the Run button, it doesn't seem to work. I see the sleepy eyes, but I never see the crazy eyes. Let's just try it again. Maybe I missed it. Yeah, I really don't see it. Okay, let's look more closely at that screen on the NXT. If you look, you can see it still says Sleepy Goodnight on the screen. So when I push the orange button, I'm selecting to run the Sleepy Goodnight program when I really wanted to run Sleepy Crazy. So let's push the gray square or a gray rectangular button to go up a level. And now it's got the name Sleepy Crazy there. And you can see if I kind of arrow through it, there's Sleepy Goodnight. There's Sleepy Crazy. And if I orange button in and now run, it says Sleepy Crazy. And sure enough, it changes the eyes. Okay. So let's just review what just happened. In the case we just encountered, we wrote the Sleepy Goodnight program, downloaded it, and ran it on our NXT. Then we wrote a new program called Sleepy and Crazy. We downloaded Sleepy and Crazy to the NXT, but we didn't read the fine print on the NXT screen, and so we didn't notice that the NXT was running Sleepy Goodnight. From the NXT's point of view, everything worked perfectly. It let you download your new program, and then since you clicked on Run on the Sleepy Goodnight program, it ran it. You might argue that the NXT didn't behave logically, that when a new program's downloaded, the NXT should expect that you want to run the new program now. And yeah, if someone from Lego came up to me and said, "Hey, Jenny, tell us how this should work," I'd tell them that when you do a download, the NXT should change its screen. But they didn't ask us, and that's not the way the NXT works. That brings us to a key concept in computing. Computers are just not very smart. In the case of the NXT, it works the way it's been designed to work, which is not necessarily how you or I would have designed it, but it's the only way it knows how to work. Remember the peanut butter and jelly example. Computers take everything you say very literally, even if what you tell them to do doesn't make sense. Even if what you want them to do is obvious to you, it's not obvious to them. Whenever something appears to go wrong with your NXT, or with your computer for that matter, it can often help to keep this in mind. By the way, I've taught variants of introductory programming courses to hundreds, maybe even thousands of students at this point. And in virtually every class, I encounter a few students who truly believe that they are completely incapable of using computers. These two quotes, "computers don't like me," and "I can't ever get computers to do what I want," are extremely typical. And they come from some incredibly bright students. So here's what I tell them. First off, when a computer doesn't do something you want it to do, it's not being mean, it's just confused. Maybe it beeps at you incessantly. Rather than thinking of the beeping as anger or hostility, you should recognize it as a cry for help. And when the computer doesn't do what you want it to do, that's often because you assume the computer is much smarter than you, where in fact the reverse is the case. We're back to the peanut butter and jelly example again. You're the smart one. The computer's relying on you to break down the problem into smaller pieces that it can understand. Alternatively, it helps some people to think of the computer as a somewhat obnoxious 6-year-old who chooses to take everything you say very literally. You know how that works. You say, "Give me a minute," and they immediately begin counting to 60. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and so on. On a rough day as a parent, this caused me no end of frustration. But on good days, as a parent who's also a computer scientist, I could occasionally use it to my advantage. If you can state the instructions precisely enough, your 6-year-old, if he or she is willing to follow your directions at all, will actually complete the task. The good news is that your computer and your NXT is always willing to follow your instructions, so your only job is to state those instructions as precisely as you can in a language that your computer or NXT can understand. Okay, let's review what we learned in this lesson. First, we discussed one reason why the NXT might not do what you expect it to do. Specifically, you download a new program, but you're still running the old one. So you need to remember that if the NXT isn't doing what you expect it to do, the first thing to do is to check the NXT screen and confirm that you're running the correct program. We also learned the importance of remembering that computers aren't very smart. They just do what you tell them to do. So most of the time, if a computer isn't doing what you expect, you should look very closely at what you're telling it to do and see if that makes sense from the computer's point of view. We'll have to think about this again in the next lesson.